Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of comparative literature in Germany. And in my PhD thesis I am researching literary hermeneutics, the art and study of understanding and interpreting literary texts. And today in my series on literary theory we are looking at hermeneutics again, but today from the Enlightenment period of the 18th century. We are looking at one famous figure that has been quite influential in creating a general hermeneutics to understand both speech and text, but whose work has been overlooked for quite some time. I'm talking about the work of Johann Martin Chladenius, who has been writing the work Einleitung zur richtigen Auslegung, vernünftiger Reden und Schriften, which could be translated to Introduction to the Correct Interpretation of Reasonable Speech and Texts. This is the edition I've got here with me. It's published in black letter or Gothic scripture, and it's absolutely beautiful, but also not as easy to read as more modern text, as you can see if I blend it in here. But I want to talk about that because Chladenius has some quite fascinating ideas that are also quite new in the middle of the 18th century. So we will go through the most important ideas to just get you a quick glimpse into this work of Enlightenment hermeneutics. So if you're ready, then just let's get started. So before we get started to talk about the work, let us quickly talk a little bit about who was Johann Martin Chladenius. His non-Latinized name would be Johann Martin Chladni, and he's been living from 1710 to 1759, so right in the middle of the Enlightenment period. He was a German philosopher, theologian and also historian, although he hasn't had a training in history, but was later regarded as one of the most influential hermeneutists in this field. And he's also seen as one of the founding fathers of the modern general hermeneutics because his work has had quite an influence. Let's just quickly look a little bit at his life. So he was the son of Martin Chladenius, who was a professor of theology at the Wittenberg University that you might know from the connection to Luther. And he had a very typical education. He was enrolled in the gymnasium and later he received his master's degree or magister at the Wittenberg University himself, and he also taught there. But later he went to the University of Leipzig, where he became an associate professor of church antiquities in 1742. And this was also the year when his famous book got published that we will talk about soon. And then he was appointed full professor of theology, rhetoric and poetry at the University of Erlangen in 1747, so pretty soon after. And he also received a doctorate in theology during the same year. He made a name for himself basically in history, as he also developed a quite pragmatic didactic theory of history and the interpretation of historical sources. The first parts of this was already published in this work that I'm talking about today, so this general interpretation guide, but then later on he also published a work called Allgemeine Geschichtswissenschaft, in which he was talking about like general historical research basically and historical interpretation, which got into more detail, but I will not talk about it today because that's not the focus of this video. He had some quite interesting ideas that we want to talk about now, that he's been developing in his major work, this Introduction to the Correct Interpretation of Reasonable Speeches and Texts. So let's get started talking about this text. The title is, as I said, Einleitung zur richtigen Auslegung vernünftiger Reden und Schriften, or Introduction to the Correct Interpretation of Reasonable Speech and Texts. So we have to talk about this title because it already gives us some indications on what the work is about. So first it says it's an introduction. So It's introducing main concepts that Chladenius' work is based upon and that he's developing in this work. And he's talking about this vernünftige Reden und Schriften, so reasonable works. And he's mainly talking about didactic works, so teachings, logical works, and works that are used at university, for example, but also historical sources, so works that have like a engaging and important content. And he makes an opposition to sinnreiche Schriften, or you could maybe translate that as like ingenious or something, so texts that are basically mostly poetic texts, fictional texts, texts that don't have like the idea behind it, that they are used for didactic, teaching, instructional purposes. So texts that have the purpose to teach you something and to state something very clearly. And this is why he's not really talking about literature. And he's also not talking about theology, because he says that's like a masterpiece. The Bible is a masterpiece, and he's got a lot of respect also as a theologian. And at the same time, as a theologian, you would expect that he would talk about that. But he says it's like more complex and it needs other kinds of interpretation, so that's not what he's talking about. So basically, most of the time he's talking about the historical sources and texts written about history, so like primary and secondary sources that you could work with. So that's also why he's been regarded like such an important figure for the historical hermeneutics later. And what is quite interesting is that the whole book that he's writing is seen as a very didactic work in itself. So it's primarily written to be used later on in classes and to teach and instruct pupils and students to learn how to interpret correctly. So in fact, I think you could even say or argue that his introduction is also an instruction in some ways, because the students reading and studying his work and his ideas, they could learn the most basic ideas behind the interpretation that he proposes. And this is also seen in the quote that I'm reading right now, because here he defines interpretation, auslegen, or exegesis. So he says, auslegen ist also nichts anderes als jemandem die Begriffe beibringen, welche nötig sind, eine Rede oder Schrift vollkommen zu verstehen oder verstehen zu lernen. And in English, this would be, interpretation is therefore nothing other than teaching someone the concepts that are necessary to fully understand or learn to understand a speech or scripture. So here you have this idea of vollkommen verstehen, fully understanding. So he has the idea that it is generally possible to fully understand something, an idea that is later not really considered anymore when you're looking at Schleiermacher, for example, who says that understanding is like an infinite task. You can never come to the like perfect, full understanding of something. But he also says that it's like learning to understand. So learning is a very important aspect here. And it's also the concepts, the Begriffe, that is basically what people need. So they need to have a certain kind of knowledge and to apply that knowledge when interpreting the text. So they have a lot of context and background knowledge. I will go into more detail on that later. But that is like the general idea. So it is possible to learn these concepts and to gain this full understanding generally. And what he says about that in paragraph 155 is quite interesting too, because he says, man versteht eine Rede oder Schrift vollkommen, wenn man alles dasjenige dabei gedenkt, was die Worte nach der Vernunft und den Regeln unserer Seele in uns vor Gedanken erwecken können. In English, One understands a speech or scripture perfectly when one thinks of everything that the words could arouse in us according to reason and the rules of our soul. Well, that's quite complicated already, as you might have guessed, as this perfect understanding would mean that you think of everything that the words could arouse in us and that the words could mean, and this according to reason and the rules of our soul. So what are the rules of our soul? How does our whole system work, how our emotions work, how our thinking, our imagination works? That would actually be something to be fully aware of and to be fully getting into in order to be able to understand perfectly. So I think, in fact, maybe Chladenius even knew himself that it's not possible. But I think the idea behind this is interesting. So as you can see later on in this, for example, the grammatical interpretation and the psychological interpretation that you find with Schleiermacher, that I've been talking about in another video already, it's that you have the idea of literal interpretation and also the psychological. So you have to understand both what the words themselves can mean and the sentences in a linguistic way. So the semantics, the pragmatics, and syntactics and stuff like that. But you would also need to understand the person writing this text and what they are thinking. So that's a very important aspect now, because Chladenius adds something to that right off the paragraph that I've been talking about. So in paragraph 156 he says, allein weil die Menschen nicht alles übersehen können, so können ihre Worte, Reden und Schriften etwas bedeuten, was sie selbst nicht willens gewesen zu reden oder zu schreiben. Und folglich kann man, indem man ihre Schriften zu verstehen sucht, Dinge, und zwar mit Grund, dabei gedenken, die den Verfassern nicht in Sinn gekommen sind. In English, but because men cannot overlook everything, their words, speeches and writings can mean something that they themselves were not willing to speak or write, and consequently, by trying to understand their writings, one can think of things and with reason that did not occur to the authors. That's quite an interesting point, because here Chladenius says it is definitely possible for interpreters to understand something that the author has not intended and the author has not even thought about themselves, because they were just in another context, they had another kind of knowledge or imagination and purpose with the text, and it's other than that of the reader and the interpreter. And that's a very, very important aspect that is from then on, I think from the Enlightenment period, it's like a no-brainer in a way. It's like what everyone believes, and it's just regarded as very important and also widely accepted. The idea that it's not only the author that has the right or the ownership of the meaning and the understanding, the right, correct understanding. So the interpreter plays a big important role from then on, and it's regarded differently from different hermeneutists, I think, but in general you could say that from this time on it's very, very important to regard this aspect as well. So he also says that you can think of things with reason that did not occur to the author, so it's not just people imagining stuff and coming up with ideas that are unreasonable, but really deciphering that from the text. So that's also interesting to know. And the next concept that I want to talk about, that is the most important concept in Chladenius' work, or at least seen as that from famous hermeneutists such as Peter Szondi and Jean Grondin, for example, who's been writing a great interesting introduction to philosophical hermeneutics and also been talking about Chladenius. They both say that this concept is the concept of the Sehe-Punkt, or viewpoint in English. And it's basically a translation from the Latin word scopus. I don't know if you heard about it or even use it. It's like generally the idea of what an author means by his text, what's the purpose, but also like the perspective that the person has for themselves, for the text. And it is very new because it brings something into hermeneutics that has not really been discussed before so much. So this idea of the scopus was already a central theme in hermeneutics since Augustine and Flacius, for example, but Chladenius added a new course to this. So this way that we're looking at texts from different perspectives, and that everyone's perspective is shaped by something different and then also shapes their understanding. And he defines this as, so the Sehe-Punkt, he defines this as diejenigen Umstände unserer Seele, Leibes und unserer ganzen Person, welche machen oder Ursache sind, dass wir uns eine Sache so und nicht anders vorstellen. In English, the definition of the viewpoint would be those circumstances of our soul, body and our whole person which make or cause us to imagine a thing in this way and not otherwise. So it's like our unique perspective that we've got of a thing on the thing that we bring to the table basically when reading. So I think this concept of the viewpoint is so important because it's like the first step into the idea of a historical distance that was relevant later on. So that's something that, for example, Peter Szondi makes very strong, and also Hans-Georg Gadamer is talking about a lot, that we have to understand where we are standing, where our ideas, prejudices and viewpoint comes from, to understand our view of things basically, and also understand that it is quite natural and reasonable and important to see that it differs from the viewpoint that other people would have looking at a text. So Chladenius makes the example of a revolution that is described in a work, in a historical work, and that is seen maybe even in the work differently from people, like for example the revolutionist or a king or someone who's not directly involved, and someone who's like an antagonist, and then also the interpretation of the whole scene, of the way it is depicted, is different from the person, depending on the person interpreting the text and their aims, desires, emotions and background in general. But at the same time, what is quite interesting to see, and also what Peter Szondi says is a little bit difficult with Chladenius, is that he still does not really overcome some of the concepts of his time, and also that there's like some contradictions in his work that he does not really solve. And one aspect I wanted to look at was the idea of the authorial intent, because that's an idea that is so present until today basically, and that's been widely discussed. And like for a long time it's been also very typical that the author's opinion and the author's interpretation of their own text matters, and even matters maybe more than the ones of the reader. But as I said, Chladenius already noticed that the reader and the interpreter, they play an important role, and he also said that it's possible to think things differently. So how does he deal with that idea of the authorial intent, and also like how do we come to the perfect understanding? So I think it's interesting to look as a last step in this video at the idea of the authorial intent, and how can we overcome problems that arise with that. That's interesting to see because it also explains a little bit more of the concept that Chladenius has. So he says in paragraph 695, Die Absicht eines Verfassers bei einer Stelle oder Buche oder überhaupt bei seinem Vortrage ist die Einschränkung der Vorstellungen, die er von der Sache oder bei der Stelle gehabt hat. In English, the intention of an author in a passage or book or in general in his presentation is the limitation of the idea he had of the matter or the passage. So his intention is limited by the idea he had of the matter or the passage. So the matter is very, very important, and that's basically what all of it is about. So the way that something is written is also important, but in general, Chladenius is always referring to the matter. So what's at hand here, what is really talked about, what is like the real topic, the most important aspects. And this is limited, the way that this is presented is limited by the author. And that's quite interesting to see already, because he says that's already like narrowed down to what the author is telling us here. So Chladenius says there's two ways in which you can not achieve the understanding of the authorial intent. One way is to overlook it or disregard it. The other one is to transgress it, to overstep it in a way. So he says, I'm only reading that in English because otherwise the video will be too long. In paragraph 696, one can refer to the author's intention in twofold cases and remind the reader that he should not lose sight of it. First, if he thinks of something in the passage which the author did not think of, in which case he transgresses the intention. Second, if he does not think of something in the passage which the author did think of, in which case the reader overlooks the intention of the author or does not achieve it. If one of the two happens or both happen at the same time, it is generally said that the reader has either exceeded or lost sight of the author's intention. But by not exceeding the intention, but also by not overlooking anything, one understands the author completely. So the idea is basically to come up with the ideas that the author had for themselves, oneself, so one does not disregard anything, but also does not read anything into the text that the author has not meant. That is also an idea that has been carried on throughout the history of hermeneutics a long time. And I think here an interesting part is that, or an interesting side note is that Chladenius is actually talking about a fictional poetic work when he's making an example here. The example that he makes is Virgil's Aeneas, one of the major works of ancient fiction. And in this, he tries to find what is the intention of Virgil. So Chladenius says, Virgil portrays Dido as a princess who fled Tyre after her husband's death and founded Carthage in ancient times, though little was known about this period in his days, so in the days of Virgil. However, Chladenius also says that his depiction has its limitations, as he did not specify the exact year, century, or even her age at the time of her flight or the city's founding. Nor did he concern himself with her religion. And he says that these details were of secondary purpose to Virgil, which was, like, his main purpose was to craft an engaging, albeit tragic story with Aeneas. And he also did not focus on making Aeneas' circumstances highly individualized. So Chladenius says that ultimately Virgil's goal must have been to entertain, knowing the readers would appreciate a vivid and sensual depiction of the story. And he's talking about some interpretations of this work, who said that Virgil's work was not as good as it could have been because it has some incongruities. For example, that looking at other sources, you could see that Dido would have lived like 300 years after Aeneas, so they couldn't have even met and stuff like that. But as Chladenius explains, that was not the most important aspect or purpose for Virgil. Chladenius criticizes the interpreters of the Aeneas, who, in his view, overstep the intention of Virgil when they criticize him for this problem that Dido would have lived so much later than Aeneas, and for other incongruities and problems that would be like, if you're looking at the more like historical facts of like the founding of Gothic and such, then you would see this work as lacking something, but that's like overstepping and transgressing the intention of Virgil. That's what Chladenius says. And of course, everything is highly debatable, but I think in general it's a quite interesting idea, because this idea that like what actually did the author want to teach us, to show us, that's like very, very important. And the solution that Chladenius offers to us in paragraph 707 is that in order not to disregard or overstep the intention of the author, interpreters should teach their students what the author's teachings were and how far his insight into this or that kind of thing extended. So that's what I'm like that's where I'm coming back to the beginning of the video, in which I said that basically it's about teaching the knowledge, the material that the author could have had at his time, so that might have been shaping his view and also limiting his intention, as we learned now. So I think that's quite an interesting idea. It's also quite difficult to do that in practice when interpreting, because how should we be able to really know what Virgil's whole education was, what kinds of texts he read? So I think this can be getting easier for more modern authors, because we often have a like very wide variety of manuscripts and also other text secondary sources, like for example diaries, letters, newspaper articles, and research that has been done in the fields of the authors and how they have been exchanging ideas with others, so that we can really learn a lot more about their life and times and what could have shaped their own ideas. But it's much, much more difficult for like earlier or older authors from, like, let's say, even early modern or medieval times, and especially in ancient times, because we just don't have a lot of sources that we can really look at. So what can you learn from the work of Chladenius? So basically I would say you could learn that it is possible to interpret generally. It is also possible to disregard or overstep the intention of an author, and the viewpoint is very important. So the way you as an interpreter look at a text and understand and read it, and this differs a lot from another person who would read and interpret a text, and also from the person writing the text. And Chladenius says the best thing you can do is learn as much as possible about the author, about the time, so get as much context knowledge as possible so that you can try to make a better interpretation and to understand better eventually. So I think that's been quite an interesting work. I have only been touching upon some points that I found very important. If you're interested in the text, I will link the whole title below and the edition that I've been reading, so you can look into that. If you have any questions, just please drop them down below. I will make more shorter videos on hermeneutics in the future, and if you want to learn something about a specific scholar in that field, in that hermeneutic history, then please just let me know, drop it down in the comments, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you very much for watching, and If you enjoyed the video and stayed till the end, maybe you would consider subscribing to the channel or liking the video. That would mean a lot to me. I really enjoyed making it and telling you a little bit about Chladenius. And for now, I'm just happy to say goodbye and see you in my next video. Bye bye.